In February of 2022, Russia decided to invade Ukraine and started a war which has changed modern Europe and the world. Who caused this war? Vladimir Putin, of course. Or was it? Sure, Putin certainly triggered this war, is an evil human, and is the face of Russian aggression against a sovereign state, but that's not the full picture. We love to put a face onto complex issues facing literally millions of individual players and people. Boris Johnson even said Putin would not have invaded if he was a woman, something which Catherine the Great would cry about in her grave, also having invaded Crimea. If we were to write a list of reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine, many people would put Putin as number one. But I would say that number one is the fact that Russia, as a nation, as a culture, as a society, will no longer exist in around 20 years or so. And this is a last-ditch effort to keep Russia in any sort of power before it's too late. What? Russia has always existed in our modern world. We can't have a world without it. Well, it might seem like Russia is big and mighty and scary, but when you look at the details of what makes Russia Russia, some flaws start to show and some existential crises are on the horizon. I'll show you how Russian politicians didn't decide to invade Ukraine, but how Russian geography, demographics, and economics made it invade, and yet the country will still fail. I mean, the war has already been a disaster for Russia. Instead of steamrolling tiny old Ukraine, they actually put up a good fight, cementing Russia's future as a dead nation, killing its export-led economy with sanctions, and weakening the demographic and geographic weaknesses it already had. This war is the beginning of the end for Russia. This is the death of Russia. How can I be so bold to claim this? I mean, let's look at Russia. It's absolutely massive. Russia is by far the largest country on Earth, stretching from Europe to China. As a continent-sized country, they have so much land to develop for themselves. Yes and no. No as in more than half of Russia looks like this, and is pretty much impossible to live in, only having small pockets of civilization wherever there is oil or minerals to be mined. That leaves all of this land uninhabited, but yes, as in there's still a lot of actually habitable land to the south and west of Russia. Here it is forested, it is flat, and it is empty. It is so hard to connect any country-wide infrastructure or supply chains together, let alone to any consumers who want Russian goods. And part of being a flat country is just naturally getting invaded. All the time. The Russians have been invaded so many times and have not been able to defend themselves with their land that their main strategy in wars has been a scorched earth policy. Basically, burn everything down and retreat into your ever-expansive land. It generally works because the Russians have so much land that the invaders break down before they take the whole country. The other strategy to keep the Russian core safe was to expand until they hit any natural or military barriers. It took them across northern Asia to the Pacific, hitting these seas and these mountains, and into the northern European plain into these forests around modern-day Poland to Romania. But in recent years, they lost this western parts and are now back here, and what used to be part of them are now part of NATO, an organization which was specifically made to counter Russian power. What used to be their natural buffer zone between the West and Russian core was now the West touching the Russian core. Sure, it's likely they won't attack Russia right now, but what if things change? NATO has many different ways to invade Russia and take Moscow if they wanted to, something which is everything against their historical strategy, as we'll see. And we're not done with the awful Russian geography yet. They have another major enemy, the water. Transporting goods on land is fine and all, but it's expensive to set up and maintain, especially when your country takes up a whole continent. Transporting goods by water is cheap, easy, and reliable. The most successful countries in history are those that have internal waterways or mastered the ocean. Russia doesn't have any water. Okay, that's an exaggeration. Of course they touch seas and have rivers, but they're pretty much useless. The Pacific Seas are so far away from the Russian core over land that it gets rid of the advantage water even had, and its Baltic and Black Sea routes are blocked. To get out of the Black Sea, Russia needs to bypass Crimea, the Turkish Straits, the Greek Aegean Sea, and then depending on the route, either the Suez Canal and Bab el-Mandeb, or Italy and the Spanish/British/Moroccan Strait of Gibraltar. That's a lot of friends they need to make that they don't have right now. To get out of the Baltic Sea, they need to pass Finland, the three Baltic brothers, Sweden, Poland, Germany, Denmark, the UK, and maybe France, Norway, and the Netherlands. These are less friends they need to make and more countries that absolutely despise Russia after centuries of living together and would block the route in a heartbeat. Okay, fine, Russia won't use its ports. How about its rivers? Still no. Most major rivers flow north to the Arctic Ocean, which is a little too cold to sail boats in. The ones that don't flow there, like the Volga, flow to the Caspian Sea, which can't be escaped from. Then some rivers flow to the Black and Baltic Seas, which run into the same problems as the ports there. And almost all rivers in Russia freeze anyways. Water has never been a strong suit. That's a major reason why they wanted Crimea first out of any Ukrainian invasion. It lets them have a hope of naval power. So to get anything done in Russia with its open flat land and its land transportation based population and economy, the Russian government's always treated the Russian people like hordes. Keep that in mind. The horde-like structure that the government has always used has defined modern Russia since the 1300s up until this very war. Low density from low connectivity and awful weather conditions meant Russia's population was always small and focused on sustenance agriculture. Russia never naturally industrialized, but when they suddenly were forced to, it created another crisis, something which invading another country will not fix. The Russian people have a much greater problem than their geography. Their people. No, I swear it's not a racist thing, it's a numbers thing. They don't have enough people to keep Russia safe or growing. First of all, many people don't realize how multi-ethnic Russia is. Only about 3/4 of Russia is even Russian. If things get bad, I'm sure the other quarter in the Caucasus or steppe or out in the boonies of Siberia wouldn't mind some extra autonomy from Moscow, especially with the lack of waterways, connections, and very low population density. But along with those fringes who could split off, Russia also does not have enough Russians. See, back in the USSR, the government maybe kind of forced everyone into a tiny apartment and made them get to work. It kickstarted industrialization, but when everyone now lives in a tiny box instead of on a huge farm, they have less kids. The faster you industrialize, the faster people stop having kids, and the faster the eventual collapse. Russia bolted and industrialized in about 15 years under Soviet orders. The Russian birth rate right now is around 1.5 kids for every woman, below the 2.1 needed to maintain replacement levels. This means that Russia is losing people. Every death in Russia is a forever death if you like to be cynical. The main places in Russia actually gaining people are those away from the core, which happen to be those of different ethnicities like the Tatars and the Chechens. Along with that, a Soviet history of not exactly the nicest conditions for political freedom or food security killed many Russians, and the brutality of the world wars cemented its eventual demographic crisis. You can trace the events of Russian history on its population pyramid quite nicely. Here are the world wars, the famine in between them, Soviet stagnation, perestroika, basically liberalizing the country, and then the collapse of the Union. The bulge down here is an echo of their baby boom here. You can see how many females are up here with no male counterpart, a product of the world wars. And alcohol. Russian men, whether through alcoholism, suicide, or crime and opioid usage after government breakdown from the USSR's collapse, are likely to die before 60 years old. During the 2000s, young men in Russia were 6 times more likely to die than young men in Iraq during American occupation. And that was during Russian peace and prosperity. The Russian people are quite literally drinking themselves to death. So a shrinking birth rate and growing death rate, which crossed after the Soviet Union fell, meant that Russia's population has been in decline since the 90s. This is before COVID killed an extra 800,000 to 1 million Russians, and the war in Ukraine is killing the remaining young men. This is Russia's last chance that it has a young male population, and a middle-aged population for that matter too, but it's unlikely a war would fix that. So if there is a demographic crisis on their way where the Russians are aging out of any consumption or export-led economy, and their geography means that they are always paranoid of an attack, how did they even get so powerful in the first place? Weren't they always doomed from the start? Russia both was and was not meant to be a great power. The whole weak geography and modern demographic things are a drag to the current Russia, but throughout history they didn't have this demographic collapse to worry about. In fact, they had a growing population for the most part. And as just a physically big chunk of land, they had a lot of people compared to other feudal European kingdoms. Modern Russia was made by the tragedy and horrors of the Mongol conquests in northern Asia. The Russian people then essentially traded prosperity for security in numbers to fight out any other invaders, and there were a lot living in the steppe and all. From this, the Russian rulers always treated the Russian people badly, more as a group of numbers to throw at their problems. It was like a pack animal strategy. Some will die in any invasion, but the ones on the inside will survive, like a horde. But since the Russian people lived too far away from one another, they could never industrialize, focusing on impoverished farming, until they got a wake-up call. Two actually. First was the Russo-Japanese War, in which a supposedly inferior Asian nation absolutely wiped the floor with Russia, and second was World War I. The Russians were under-equipped, had no industry, and lacked any supply chains or coherent transportation methods. Their strategy of just throwing people at fronts and moving forward on flat land broke in World War I when the front didn't move, and it ended with millions of Russians dying in the trenches. The war was brutal, and it's no surprise Russia pulled out of it, having a revolution and then a civil war, now turning communist and collectivist. No surprise that a community-driven, united in grief, horde-like population would be the first one ever to try out a communist government. The forced industrialization by shoving people into small apartments and makeshift factories, which would make OSHA cry, kickstarted demographic collapse, but it also made life expectancy rise, causing more people to live in the USSR than ever before. This is what made Russia rise to power. It simply had a ton of people. But the whole communist shtick still didn't change the serf-like conditions. But the leaders couldn't keep the population poor forever. They needed something for themselves to get rich. So quotas were made based on numbers, not value, and extra production was taken. It made people cut a lot of corners. Farmers stopped growing grain because their extra profit was not going to themselves. Mass famines ensued. Steel workers often made their plates too small or too thin to meet the number quotas. Soviet equipment failed as a result. There was no coherent supply chain or communication. That failed equipment took a long time to be made. Soviet cars, planes, tractors, buildings, rockets, and military equipment were all made by cutting corners, and they all suck. No offense. To feed this industrialization, they took from the farmers, which led to, you guessed it, famine. And if you complained, you guessed it, you got a free trip to Siberia. And then World War II happened, and oh boy, it was a killer. Literally. The throwing people at Germans and scorched earth policies killed over 15% of the entire country, mainly civilians. The horrors of the Soviet Union and before led to this high death rate and low birth rate, but there was hope in the 60s when the USSR became a major producer of oil and gas, leading to more people, leading to them realizing life sucks, leading to perestroika, the leaders easing up a bit on the stringency of the Soviet Union. Turns out if you give the people a little bit of freedom, they want the full thing, and the Soviet bloc crumbled in the early 90s, including itself. Good for the people, maybe, bad for the whole pack animal strategy. After 1991, Russia was in freefall. Their geopolitical strategy just broke. The cut in state spending, aka collapse of all government services, and drug problems led to a death rate that would kill the nation in 50 years, and Russians were leaving in droves, especially educated ones. Not only that, but their buffer states turned into their enemies, joining NATO and the EU. I guess that's what happens when you treat them like your own pawns. Keep in mind, this safety in number strategy has kept the Russians together since the 1300s, and it all ended in 1991. It was how Russia was born in the first place. It didn't matter if you didn't have natural defenses, you had numbers. It didn't matter if you didn't have industry, you had numbers. But this strategy also killed its birth rate, and after those buffer states vanished and the population literally halved after 1991 from the Soviets' collapse, there was a crisis. Without this strategy, would there even be a Russia? The answer is no, and the Ukraine war was a last-ditch attempt to fix that. After 1991, there was chaos, hyperinflation, corruption, and oligarchs taking over Russia. Economically, their industry crashed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but their energy sector didn't. It didn't take long for a new Russia, one under Vladimir Putin, to find its new economic purpose in 1999. The answer? 2 words, or I guess 1 word: Petrostate. Russia is a key exporter of many crucial materials, sure, minerals, ores, food, fertilizer, blah blah blah, but there is nothing quite like their petroleum, oil, and natural gas exports. They account for over half of their whole profile, then ores, and then metals. They love digging stuff up in their massive territory and shipping it outwards, but shipping is not easy, especially with no water. So, they use thousands of kilometer-long pipes to supply their oil to mainly Europe. Their pipes being mainly built in the Soviet era and where the West and East blocks met. This means their pipes pretty much don't go past Germany and the former Yugoslavia, but it also means these places with huge manufacturing capacity get an easy source of energy. Now, while this might seem great for the Russians as they're essentially trapping Europe, especially Germany, become their sole supplier of energy, and they do love natural resource-based threats, it might be more of a trap for the Russians. See, Russia has almost no internal demand due to their boomer age demographic structure, but Europe is also aging out of demand too. But before that, Russia is aging out of an export-led middle-aged demographic. Not only that, but this is pretty much all Russia has. They've become a one-trick pony of an oil and metal supplier to Europe. They are extremely vulnerable to, I don't know, Western sanctions or any drop in European demand or Germany booting up coal-based energy again. This export-oriented, natural resource-based economy works better than the industrial command-driven economy until there is any slight disruption among their energy supply lines. Any one pipeline getting blown up would have grave effects on Russia. Any slight disruption with Turkey or Greece or Denmark or any of the other 20 countries would have grave effects on their oil that actually goes by sea. So once again, demographics have screwed Russia over, only having around 10 to 20 years left before not just demographic collapse, but economic collapse. And I think it was brought a little early after massive sanctions on all things Russia. The one advantage the country has going into an economic collapse or a world in which trade outside of Russia is greatly reduced is that Russia at least has enough food and enough fuel to keep itself running. The rest of the country will suffer though. So if Russia has a weak land, a demographic crisis, and a breakdown of the strategy that made Russia Russian, why is invading Ukraine the answer? Kind of access to more people, although they would need to control a country of 45 million. Hard task. Kind of to getting more land and sea lanes back, they do want that sweet buffer and human meat shield. And kind of to getting some industry back. Ukraine is an agricultural powerhouse. Russia wouldn't mind that. Their economy has been in freefall since 1991, and its new strategy of becoming a Petrostate exporter to Europe will fail within a decade or two. Their population was destroyed from years of Soviet abuse, and even if they restored their borders, they would still have a demographic collapse. To get its power, old economy, and honestly its pride back, Russia wants its old borders. Of course, since all of these states are now NATO and EU affiliated, Ukraine was the best choice. I mean, what Russia saw when they looked at Ukraine was a flat, weak, disorganized, divided country. And to be fair to Russia, it was all of those things. Ukraine was only supposed to be the start of years of war getting their old borders back. Ukraine was the test ground, and it failed badly for the Russians. The war is a stalemate, signifying that Russia is already done. This is the final nail in their coffin. American and European strategists could go home and cheer that, oh my god, Russia can't even take over Ukraine. But then the next day they'll come back terrified and sad that, oh my god, Russia can't even take over Ukraine. If this is really a war of Russian survival, then there's another much scarier option they can use. The N-word. No, not that N-word. Nukes. The Russians have the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth. If the Russians really feel backed into a corner trying to hold on to any Russian power, nukes definitely are not out of the question. It's their final option, but if they do use it, they are guaranteeing the death of Russia anyways after they will be nuked countlessly in retaliation. A new Russia after this crisis could have an independent steppe, Caucasus, Siberia, Chinese/Japanese controlled regions, or Muslim controlled regions, or new government. I don't know the details. What I do know is by declaring this war in Ukraine, Russia has all but admitted that they know Russia is going to collapse, and they will do anything to stay in power no matter the consequences. The beginning of the end of Russia is here, but they are still here to stay for a couple of decades. As an increasingly panicked Russia tries to keep power, a scary question for border countries comes up. The question isn't, are the Russians going to swing at someone to stay in power? They've already done that. The question is, who else will the Russians swing at?